Welcome to my revision of my American History Notes, where I go over what I've already published and look at, examine what I want to dig deeper into. And there's lots of things I'm going to be adding to and changing. So let's pick it up where I left off about Lincoln. Now, even after the Lincoln-Douglas debates and as late as 1859, Lincoln was still insisting that he was not fit to be president. I see an ironic contrast with the great immoral movements of today, such as radical homosexual activism and the so-called pro-choice movement and what was happening with slavery. Lincoln's words about slavery in the South apply today about these movements. He said in a speech in New York in 1860 that only one thing would satisfy the South. Quote, this and this only, cease to call slavery wrong and join them in calling it right, unquote. Seem familiar? At the Republican State Convention in Decatur, Illinois, Lincoln's followers tagged him with the nickname the Rail Splitter. The Republican National Convention in Chicago saw Senator William Seward with the largest amount of delegates, but of Lincoln's supporters, against his express orders, promised influential government positions to delegates if they would throw their support to Lincoln. Now, the Buchanan-Douglas split in the Democratic Party hampered them in the general election. The remnants of the Whigs and the Know-Nothings formed a constitutional Union party and nominated their own man. Lincoln beat his opponents but did not obtain a majority of the votes. The damaging influence of a third party in siphoning off votes from a candidate would play an important part in other elections, but most notably in our general time frame, the Clinton-Bush-Perot face-off of 1992. After his election, he had a vision which he described to his secretary, John Hay, in which he saw himself a pale ghost, and his wife claimed that it was a sign that he would be reelected to a second term but not survive it. This proved true. In spite of in spite of his objections at the convention, he did make good on the promises made by his supporters to appoint certain men to cabinet positions. A letter written by a young girl from New York prompted him to grow a beard. He later invited the girl to meet him. Many people thought that considering how his cabinet appointments came about and with his reaction to his child's superstitions, he was too much of a small town politician to be president. Warned of a supposed plot in Baltimore to kill him, he arrived unannounced in Washington for his inauguration. By the time he reached the capital, 7 Southern states had left the Union, formed the Confederate States of America, and elected Jefferson Davis as their president. President Buchanan was simply not doing anything. Now, in his inaugural speech, he denied that it was his intent to abolish slavery because he had no lawful right to do so. But he warned that he also did not recognize secession as lawful either. He said he didn't want violence, but the decision was in the South's hands, not his. Most federal forts in the South had been taken over without a shot being fired, but Lincoln decided to test the Southern government by sending supplies to Fort Sumter on an island off Charleston, South Carolina. He even notified South Carolina he was intending to do so. By this, it was Lincoln who sparked the Civil War, precipitating a bombardment of Fort Sumter by Confederate artillery, which resulted in its surrender 2 days later. Without seeking a diplomatic end to the division between the North and the South, which had existed since the country began, as decried by Madison and others, his naive, quote, test of the South's resolve put him in a position where war was inevitable. The day after Fort Sumter fell, Lincoln ordered up 75,000 militia troops to join the regular army and to take back the forts and property that had been seized by the Union, not ostensibly at first, to force the South to submit and rejoin the Union. Hundreds of thousands of volunteers rushed to join Lincoln's army, with the North and South both thinking that there would be a quick end to the war, each assuming a military superiority. However, the South lacked the manufacturing facilities required to make themselves sufficient in armaments, and the North was able to effectively blockade their ports and limit imports of food and military hardware. In addition, much hope for foreign acknowledgment of the South as a separate nation did not come except for the Pope's letter to Jefferson Davis late in 1863, which, when made public, resulted in a mass desertion of Northern Catholics. Lincoln is also quoted as lamenting the papal interference in the American conflict, which only prolonged the misery, which resulted in 600,000 military deaths, most from disease and many from brutal battles in one of the first truly modern wars. This war saw submarines, landmines, extensive entrenchments, aerial observations from balloons, and many other military innovations. Now, one thing I want to add about this that I didn't say before is that unlike the myth that the South had no chance of winning, really the South should have won. Let me explain my argument about that. First off, the North had to invade another country, had to have supply lines and logistics that it could protect while it fought this war. And if the Confederacy had done like the Revolutionary Army did in the South and give up the cities and keep the army in the field and keep battering the North and making it bleed, then it's possible they could have won. And I'll tell you why I think that as well. General Grant, in his biography, his autobiography, he said that if they had left General Johnston in charge, and kept maneuvering and kept hitting the North hard, the amount of bloodletting was getting to the point where if the war had lasted one more year, the North would have given up. The South would have had their land, had their country. There would have been no problem. Um, Grant said that in his autobiography, so you can read that. And uh, Sherman, General Sherman, who invaded the South and is notorious and famous for his March to the Sea, he became a friend of Joe Johnston, and he said he was the toughest general he ever fought because he could not crush his army. He kept outmaneuvering him, which is exactly what Nathaniel Greene and the Continental Army did in the Revolutionary War, which wore the British down and wound up them being penned in Yorktown. So keep that in mind when you think about when you say read somebody say, well, the South had no chance. They didn't have manufacturing. They didn't have foreign acknowledgement of they didn't have this, that. The North had the tougher problem, and they were able to overcome it. And the South, Jeff Davis, as there's a famous book by Edward Pollard about the Lost Cause, and I've read that. And his argument was Jefferson Davis was the wrong man for president because he had the wrong. He could not have won. He couldn't win the war. He was the wrong man to be leader, and that was a mistake they made. And that was he said the South lost the war for want of a president. Anyway, those are things to consider, and that's what I'll be adding more of that when I finish my revision here. But let's stop and continue on. I'm going to talk about the first black soldiers on the North side to fight, and a controversy about were there black soldiers on the South. Thank you.